Like according to Balboni, we always need to focus on the fact that you're not entering a classroom and impose a language and a culture to other people. It's a conversation. As a teacher, you need to be a student yourself. You need to know the culture that you are interacting with. You need to know your students, their passion. And then, of course, that requires a lot of work.
Welcome back to The Last Days of Rome. This is episode 10. For those of you who have watched all 10 episodes, thank you for your support. We really appreciate the 7 of you and look forward to many more. In this episode, I speak with Irene Rosati, a PhD linguist, and with Irene, we talk about second language acquisition. So for any of you who are studying a foreign language, you'll find this one particularly useful, especially in the context of learning about why you're struggling, why certain things are difficult, but also if you're thinking about studying a second language, or if you're not, just watch the episode. Whoever you are, whatever your language experience, you'll enjoy it. All right, thanks for chatting with me, Irene.
Thank you.
So you were the perfect person to speak to about this topic, because as you were just explaining to me, you've done your PhD in language acquisition, and you also speak several languages. I'm aware of you speaking 3. How many do you actually speak?
It depends. I mean, I speak well at a proficiency level, or let's say upper intermediate level, probably 3. Italian, my mother tongue, English and Japanese. Then I speak a little bit of Korean, but really, really tiny bit. And I would say maybe intermediate of Spanish.
Right, so you're no stranger to learning other languages.
No, not at all.
What counts as proficient, by the way? Because I saw that word come up a lot in my research.
For sure.
Is it just simply your ability to express yourself? What would count as, let's say, in terms of levels, A1, A2, B1, B2?
Okay. That's a good question. So generically speaking, at least for European languages, we usually refer to the European Framework for Languages, which let's say a catalog, a list of European languages that is divided in level according of ability, so written or spoken ability. For each level, there is some skills that the learner needs to be able to have in order to survive in a certain situation. So let's say, for example, at elementary level or A1, the speaker, generically speaking, is able to communicate, but at a very basic level, so makes continuous mistake, cannot conjugate verbs properly, but maybe can say can use few familiar words to express in a context where he feels comfortable. At proficiency level, you have basically the ability to express and use the language, let's say, in a way that you have fluency, you can think in the language, you can survive in the environment, you can use the language also at a higher academic level, so university, working. Proficiency level, usually it's considered also the level that gets closer to the native speaker. So proficiency level are 2 levels, which is C1 or C2. C1 usually is the level that is required in any language, let's say to work in a university or study or to work in any environment. C2, the real proficiency, is the level that compare exactly to a native speaker. So you can speak exactly, I wouldn't use maybe the word exactly, but you can speak as good as a native speaker.
Right.
Your performance will pass for one as a native speaker.
Interesting. I would have thought proficiency would have meant a lower level, like let's say B1 or something, just where you can kind of get by.
That's intermediate. That's intermediate level. That's the interesting, the B level is called the threshold level. Threshold level is the level that allow you to survive in an environment. Let's say you start learning Japanese. You move to Japan, you get the skills that allow you to survive in Japan. So which means you go to buy grocery, you go to restaurants, you can make a few conversation. You can start to read a little bit like simple textbooks. So this is the threshold level. So you're able to survive in that environment, so in the country where the language is spoken. So that's the B level, the intermediate level. Higher than that, you're moving towards proficiency. So you get closer and closer and closer to the native speakers.
Yeah. So B level is more sufficient.
Yes.
in a way. It's just enough.
Yes, it's just enough. It's just enough to survive, which means that you can start to have conversation with people, and the topic and the words you're using, they gets a bit more like wide, I guess. But you still, let's say, you're not able to express yourself as a native speaker. But again, we always need to be a little bit careful when we say express yourself as a native speaker, because one of the biggest questions of linguists is, can you really reach the level of a native speaker? And that creates a little trouble, because as linguists, we talk often about critical period hypothesis, for which some researchers believe that you can only really achieve that pure proficiency level if you study a language when you are a child.
Yeah, so it's usually the cutoff date, if I'm not mistaken, is at around 12 or 13. Is that correct?
That's a good point. We're still not totally sure, but what we, based on research and experiment, what we know so far is that it seems to be this way. I mean, what happens is that by the age of 13, there is this process that interests the brain called lateralization, for which the hemispheres function, they divide. So right hemisphere for certain thing, left hemisphere for other things. Language, it's one that belongs to left hemisphere. So when this process terminates, it becomes harder for like a person to learn a second language. That's what they see. So the ideal period. So at the beginning, the first hypothesis was the critical period hypothesis. Now we talk about multiple periods hypothesis, because what we saw is that actually the human brain seems to have different periods. So the ideal would be to learn a second language by the age of 4 years old. So by that time, a kid can learn language in an easy way, fun way, and the competence will pass for one of a native speaker. So what happens is that as you age, you can still learn a language, you can still learn 2, 3, 4 languages, and you can learn it perfectly. You can do even level tests. If you focus yourself, you can reach amazing
Right, so
goals.
people shouldn't be discouraged.
No, they shouldn't. You can still achieve very good results. However, what's the difference? If we take a child before the age of 4, or let's say generically speaking before the age of 12, but I would say a little bit even younger, probably 8, and then we take a young adult, and both they study the language, we put them in the country where the language is spoken, so we present them the same amount of input for the same amount of time. What we'll see is that possibly both will reach a very good level, but the child, the competence, the way the child will speak, like it's his or her performance will pass for a native speaker. With the adult, that would be harder. So what that means, the particular pronunciation would be the hardest things to acquire for an adult, while that's not the case for kids.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I also did read that there have been rare cases where adult learners do outperform children. What's happening there?
So that's true, but that's something that we need to be careful about when we talk about competence. Is a very generic word. Competence in what? So what what the study says at least is this, that you can achieve as adult actually higher competence than a child in terms of vocabulary. So you can learn way more words, obviously, than a child. So if you, for example, start to study Japanese, the example that we said before, you study for 10 years, you take a child born in Japan and learn the language, spend there 10 years of his life, perhaps you might have access to way more words than that child. But still, that doesn't mean that your performance will pass for one of a native speaker. It's the pronunciation, because the way the mouth works will have more trouble, because you learn how to, like to produce a certain sound and move your mouth in a certain way. So it's like mouth is a muscle. So the way you exercise a muscle when you're 20 is not the same as when you're like 5 or something like that. But again, it has been a very rare case of also a very good level of proficiency in pronunciation for adult. But that's something, let's say, extremely rare. What happens is that you need to have the time and dedication and motivation that push you to reach that pronunciation, because also the main goal of language is to communicate. So if I can communicate with you and Yeah, okay, that's don't put me down now. But if we can have a communication, you understand what I'm saying. Doesn't matter really my accent. Does it really matter that you can understand that I'm Italian? That's absolutely fine. That's not a problem. So at the end of the day, the brain also tends to get a little bit lazy. The brain knows it's like, I'm doing this huge effort studying language, but do I want really to pass for a native speaker when I'm not.
Yeah, it's not really that important.
It's not that important. Important is, can I communicate with, like efficient? Like, can I communicate efficiently? Then if the answer is yes, then that's a kind of proficiency to me.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Speaking of the sounds that people make, or the sounds that people are able to make, one thing I've noticed is you can always tell when an Italian specifically has an advanced level of English by if they can pronounce TH.
Yes.
That's an interesting one. Yes, exactly. I don't know why. That seems to be very difficult. I guess because you don't have it, right?
Exactly. This is a good point. Not just the TH, but just the H, like a house. For us, it's like it's non-natural. We are doing like an effort to move like our articulatory system, the phonetic like articulator in the mouth in a certain way. Like you need to put the organs in a certain way, and we're just not used to it.
Right.
And that's the problem. So the second problem is this: you might even you can train yourself, right, to say house or the, but it's a sound that we really don't have. So we always struggle. What happens is that the more this is like a paradox. The more you get fluent in a language, the more goes a little bit down the accuracy. Because I'm speaking fast enough, sometimes my brain doesn't have time to tell my mouth, wait, Irene, pay attention to the. I don't have these sounds in like my background, so if I speak quickly enough, sometimes I will forget that. I would say,
Right.
Say the or house instead of house. So that's also an interesting thing.
Yeah, so the more advanced you get in a language, the faster you're able to speak, but then you sacrifice accuracy.
A little bit, yes. We saw this. Then there's been some recordings of to record like the performance of like proficiency people. Unless this is a different speech. If you have if one of your parents, it's from the country where the language is spoken, the language that you would like to acquire, there's a different thing. But let's take the case of a person that moved to Australia and started to learn English here. So for this person, study very hard, listening to music. There's a lot of activity that can help not to acquire language properly, reach proficiency, let's say a C1 level, which is a very good level, and start to speak fluent. When you speak fluent, that fluency means fast execution. So because you're talking fast enough, so that's the fluency, the accuracy, so your brain is not thinking anymore about what you're doing. It's not like, okay, I need to use TH, so I need to do this. It goes like on an automatic pilot. When that happens, sometimes also some mistake can happen.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And obviously it works the other way around as well. Yes. For a lot of native English speakers, the silent G in Italian can be very difficult, as well as maybe rolling their R's, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. It's the same thing. But again, I hear this with like a lot of students, they complain about this. It's like, I've been studying this language for 10 years and I still make this mistake, or I still can't pronounce like the R in Italian properly. But again, there's nothing to do with the competence. Like the language is fine. You can speak the language, you can communicate, you can survive in the environment, or you can thrive in even like difficult environment, like academic environment. But the pronunciation usually, it's the difficult one. And then the accent is probably even the most difficult one.
Right.
To speak like you don't have an accent is a very difficult thing to do. And honestly, at the end of the day, who cares? Exactly. What's the point? You see a lot of like videos on Instagram of very cool people. They can speak the language perfectly with a perfect accent, but also it's like you're trying to hide where you're from.
Right.
And I think it's a little bit sad.
Yeah.
Language is not for that.
I don't really see the point.
Exactly.
For example, when I'm speaking Italian, the point isn't to mimic an Italian.
Exactly.
Or to portray myself as an Italian.
Exactly.
Because I'm not. And so I've never quite understood that one. It seems a bit vague, a bit vain in a way, like trying to show off. Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's like a show off, which is fine for a video on Instagram. But then again, language exists for a reason. And the main reason is to communicate a message from one person to another one. That's the main reason. Then there's also other reasons like this beauty, arts, and all sorts of stuff. But the core is always to communicate a message. And if the message has been sent properly and the receiver can understand properly, that's it. Communication has done. So that's the main reason. And then also we need to remember that languages, all the languages, they answer to a principle, which is like an economic principle of language, which means that the speaker will always tend to try to send the most concise, concise message, but with the less effort possible from an articulatory point of view. And that's the other reason why of that TH mistake. If I'm talking and I'm more focused on the message than on the form, again, the accuracy goes a little bit behind. But that's not a mistake. This is something that all the language seems to fall into. Like the language tends to be like as simple as possible. And you see this in slang. Like this slang, and a lot of people complain, oh, why these slangs? Why you can't say the sentence properly? Why these shortcuts? It's just the nature of language itself. I want to send a message, but I need to require less effort as possible from my brain and from my mouth.
Yeah, putting it economically is an interesting way to do it. Okay, so let's go back to the difficulties that adults have acquiring a second language. And maybe we can talk in a way that's less academic, like, instead of the sort of brain stuff, which is interesting. But what might be some of the ways that adults who are beginning their language learning journey, what might be some of the difficulties they face, generally speaking? Is it because a lot of people say, I'm not good at languages, right?
Yes, I hear that all the time.
But since language is an innate part of being a human, that's never really made much sense to me. I've often thought that what they mean by that is they don't like grammar lessons. They don't like sitting in a sort of formal classroom environment. They're bored by grammar, and therefore that sort of turns them off learning the language in general. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, absolutely. So that's it's actually a good question. So like as human being, we know one thing, that we are born with a brain that somehow is wired to learn languages, and this is a fact. There's been a lot of studies in the past. Like
Chomsky, right?
Chomsky, exactly. So Chomsky talks about LAD, so language acquisition device. So we have this type of, imagine like a machine in our brain that is there exactly for us to acquire language, to learn a language. So it's something that separate us from animals. So animals can communicate, but we have this capacity to use a system of sign, which could be alphabets or sounds or whatever, and to articulate, to create an infinitive possibility of sentences. And this is something unique for human being. So that's why Chomsky thinks, okay, there has to be something in our brain that allows us to learn language. Some people also criticize Chomsky, said, well, it's probably also something that has to do with the environment as well, where you are, who you're talking to, what's the feedback that the person you're talking to is giving to you. And we know today there is a mix of these two different positions. But definitely there is something in our brain that facilitates language acquisition. However, what happens? Why for adults is more difficult? Well, first of all, we know, I'm trying not to be too technical, but we need to go back a little bit at what happens in our brain. So if you look at a picture of a 5-year-old kid who is learning language, you will see they have so many neuronal connections, and it's almost impressive. And if you take a 20-year-old, so I'm not talking about old person, like a 20-year-old young guy who try to study language, will have nice, very clear pathways, neural connection, but not as many as the child.
Right.
Okay, because the brain is developing, it's forming. So it's easier when you're a child. We saw that before, but that doesn't mean that you cannot learn a language. Absolutely. We have this device in our brain, let's say, so we are prone to learn languages. What happens in reality is how the language is taught. So one of the biggest linguists at the end of the 1980s, Stephen Krashen, he created this theory, the input hypothesis. He thought this is like, okay, why as a child we learn a language spontaneously? Why is it difficult when we are adult? So it has to be, there must be something different behind what happened in the brain, right? So we know there is this difference in the brain. As you grow up, it becomes a little bit harder. Something else that happened is the input. So he did this kind of experiments. If I take a person, let's say, I'll take you as example. Okay, you want to speak Japanese. You don't go to Japan, you stay here and you follow classes. You do, 3 hours a day of Japanese. Within a year's time, maybe you learn something. But if I take you and I bring you to Japan, and the same amount of time you're spending in Japan, your ability to improve the language would be twice as much as is in the first case. So he started to wonder, why is that? It's all have to do with the input. So you need to be surrounded by the input, okay? So when you're an adult, it's really important that you have as much exposure as possible to the language that you want to learn. But that's not sufficient. What he found out is that you need to have access to a comprehensible input. So the language needs to be comprehensible. Now the question is, how do you make comprehensible a language that you don't know? So I'll give you this example, okay? Can I take the pencil? Okay. Let's put the case. So this is a pencil. I would say this in Italian, okay? Now, you know Italian, okay? Oh, I'll use Japanese, actually. That's a good example. You don't know Japanese, right?
At all.
Never study.
Never.
So you have
Well, actually, in year 8, I did, but my teacher would agree that I never studied.
Okay, so you know nothing about Japanese.
No.
Okay. So I look in my eyes and saying this. Kore wa impizzi desu. You have no idea what I'm talking about.
No.
Kore wa impizzi desu. Okay, so Stephen Krashen does a similar example, but with German. But I'm not able to speak German, so I can't use this example. If I did this, kore wa impizzi desu. Kore wa impizzi desu. What am I saying?
This is a pencil.
Exactly. This is exactly the point. So I'm saying exactly the same thing, exactly the same language, and you don't know the language that I'm using, right? But what I'm doing, I'm making the input that is exactly the same. Kore wa impizzi desu is exactly the same. But in the second example, I'm making it comprehensible to you. I'll give you this back.
Thank you.
So
I felt naked without my pencil.
So keep the pencil. But I mean, what it does is this: is like, if I make comprehensible the input, you understand. And how it's possible that you understood, but you never studied Japanese? Because again, we said that in the brain, there's probably, we're not sure, but there is this like, the way the brain is wired in somehow makes learning language easier for us.
Right.
So if you can have the input and you can manipulate or somehow make it easier, then the person will learn. But how to make that? You need to adjust that input to the person that you're talking to. And here is the difficulty. So let's say you go to a language class. The teacher doesn't do this. The teacher just starts to speak blah, 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 blah. You get lost. You get frustrated. You start to develop anxiety. You don't want to go to the classroom back anymore. You drop your Japanese class. You're going to hate Japanese. You never want to go back and study any other language. So the important is that you surround yourself by the right input, by the right teacher, because it's a lot to do with teachers if you go to a class, for example. But again, that's not a sufficient condition. Then he discovered another thing. A lot of this has to do with your personality. Are you an introvert? Are you an extrovert? Apparently, your personality as well influences the way you learn.
Right.
Extrovert people seems to be more prone to like acquire a language. Why is that? Probably because they speak more, so they tend to use and practice the language more. Another thing very important is what he calls another hypothesis that Krashen called as the emotional filter. Okay. What is it, an emotional filter? So he supposed that basically in the brain, there is something for which if you are in an environment where you don't feel comfortable and you feel the pressure and the level of anxiety goes up, it's like a filter to your brain. So if the anxiety goes up to a level that basically stops, that device that the Chomsky call LAD doesn't work anymore. It stopped because you have too much anxiety, too much pressure.
Right. That becomes like a prohibitive factor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It becomes a prohibitive factor. So if that happens, doesn't matter. You can put yourself 10 hours or study Japanese. You can go to Japan. You're never going to learn the language or you're never going to reach a very high level. So very important is that, according to Krashen and a lot of linguists, is that we learn a language with an input that is comprehensible. So it's adapt to your level, or you have people that are helping you somehow that, like, for example, speaking slower or like repeating words, for example, but with a low level of anxiety. So you need to be in an environment where you feel comfortable. So if you feel comfortable enough, and this is a lot of mistakes that you see in classes, for example, you study a language because you have to study, because it's part of your curriculum. What does it tell you? I mean, you're not going to have this kind of feeling towards the language, like, oh, I'm happy to study. You see the language as a subject.
A source of pressure.
There's a lot of pressure. There is exams. And all this sort of stuff, unfortunately, don't work well with language. So you need to be in a relaxed environment. You need to try to practice as much as you want. But again, another way to lower the level of anxiety is learning the language by doing something that you like. What's your interest? That's where we suggest adults. Like, are you interested in music? Okay. Listen to music in the language. Are you interested in book? Read books in the language. Are you interested in making conversation with people about a certain topic? Go on TED and start to talk about a certain topic. So things like that. So I think it's important really to associate the language with something that you like, with something that in some way remove the pressure and anxiety.
Yeah, that makes sense. Also, didn't Krashen say something along the lines of new language should only be mildly challenging. So it should be just above your level, right?
Exactly. This is what we call like the comprehensible input plus what we call I or intake. Right. So what it is, the comprehensible input plus the intake? It means this. So this is your level. Let's say you start studying Italian, okay? You speak very well Italian, your level is intermediate. So what happens is, as a teacher that I'm teaching you, if I come with a level that is exactly the same level, so I'm not challenging, you will get bored. You're not challenged enough. And what happens is that your capacity, your skills, either will go towards a fossilization. We can talk about this later, but just the fossilization is basically your process of learning a language gets stuck. So you're stuck in that level. Your skills and ability won't improve.
I think that's where I am, actually. But anyway, that's another topic.
Yeah, but we can talk about that. And there's a reason why fossilization happens. Usually it's the motivation, or there's no need to push a little bit harder. But if I come in the classroom and I present the opposite, I come with this input, which could be material, the lesson I prepare, and it's too hard, then you are demotivated as well. Because like, oh, I'm not understanding anything, start to have anxiety, start to have pressure. You start to have like self-judgmental thoughts, like, oh, I'm not able enough, I'm not understanding. You put yourself down, the affective filter goes up, again, you don't learn. So that's why he said it's important to have the comprehensible input plus a little bit more than what is your current level. So what is your current level? Let's say upper intermediate. I can give you a little bit more to push you towards advanced level.
Right.
Okay, so that's why it's very important for the teacher to know, first of all, who has in classroom, who is like your student, the background, what you like, what you don't like, the way you tend to learn, because each of us has, our own unique way to learn languages and all sorts of stuff. But of course, usually in classroom, there's not enough time for a teacher to do all this type of, consideration. So, and that's what makes learning a bit harder.
So would you say that's probably why you're better off taking private one-on-one classes so that the teacher can tailor the material to you specifically, as opposed to being in a class of 15, 20 people?
Honestly, it depends on your teacher. It always depends on your teacher and depends on the way you learn. Again, not everyone learns the same way. Some people prefer to be in classroom because in a class you feel more, I don't know, like you get new friends. Some people prefer to do one-to-one lesson. Really depends. Generically speaking, I would say that it's easier, but not for the students, but from the teacher point of view, it's easier to create a lesson for one person than it is to create a lesson for 30 people.
Right.
Okay, that's different. The ideal way for me would be for you to go to the country where the language is spoken and to learn the language there. Surround yourself mainly by native speakers or people who only speak the language. Forget a little bit of your language for a while, at least until you achieve a good level, at least intermediate or upper intermediate level.
That makes a lot of sense. So yeah, coming back to this sort of topic of immersion, it would not only be that you're exposed to the new language, but also kind of what you just alluded to, that you're no longer able to revert back. Because in your first example, learning Japanese for 3 hours, well, the rest of the time I'd be speaking English. Whereas in Japan, I wouldn't have the ability to do that as often. And surely that's also a huge factor, not reverting back to the language you're used to.
Absolutely, for two reasons. So first of all, when you are in the language in the country where the language is spoken, there is like a switch in your brain. You are in a survival mode. So you speaking the language is not anymore a matter of, oh, I'm fancy, I can make a video for Instagram. It's not a matter of this. It's a matter of, oh my God, I need to survive. I need to buy food and I need to communicate that I want this food or not that food, or that I want chicken without spicy, for example. And I need to use my Japanese level to make myself like understanding. So it's a survival instinct as well that comes to. And you don't have the support of your language anymore. So if you don't have the support of your language, you're forced to learn a language. And this is also a difficulty that a lot of English-speaking people find abroad. Because once you know English is a little bit of your like comfortable pillow that you carry with you. It's like, oh, I can use the language. I can use the Spanish or the Italian or Japanese. Okay, I'll switch to English. Everyone knows English. And then what happened? Then you use English, but you're not practicing with the language that you're supposed to be immersed to. So that also happens. Second thing that happens also is that it's very good to learn many languages, but what happens once we learn a second language, we have this transfer. So it's not that you study the second language. Even if you go to Japan or to Italy and you forget about your language and you start to speak in Japanese or you start speaking Italian, it's not that you really forget about your language. Your brain will always use as a reference, especially at the beginning, the structure of the language that you know, so the first language. And that creates sometimes in the execution of the new language, a transfer that can be either positive or negative. So let's say you go to Italy, you start to speak Italian, and then you like your brain at some point tricks you. You're trying to use a sentence, but you're not even, without even realizing, you're using the sentence in the way you say it in English. So that's a negative transfer. So you make that certain mistake because of your native speaker, because of your native language. So if you weren't, for example, English speaking, if you were a Spanish speaker, you will make a different type of...
Exactly. So the mistake is specific to your native language.
There is this other theory called the interlanguage hypothesis by Selinger, which tells us this, that between the first language, so this is the language, your native language, English, let's say, and the second one, let's say Italian, there is an infinitive, like, different type of languages. There are different versions that goes from English to English and a little bit of Italian, a little bit more of Italian, a bit more Italian, a bit less English. So different version of language, they're not either English or Italian. And when you are in this continuum, sometimes your brain pick up something from the English, sometimes takes from the Italian.
This is while you're learning.
While you're learning.
So you're kind of on that spectrum.
You are on that spectrum while you're learning. However, we really don't know if that happens. Even if you are full proficiency, you still sometimes can go and pick up something from your native language because it's your support. You know, it's something you acquired when you were a child, so it's a little bit easier.
Okay. I want to come back to the kids learning languages for a second. So I'm going to give you an example that would never get approved by an ethics committee, but imagine there was a study for a second, because you were talking about the sort of Chomsky's, is it universal grammar or what did you call it? The LA?
Language acquisition device.
Okay. So imagine if we were to take a group of babies and put them in an environment where they were cared for. So, you know, we had robots giving them food and changing their nappies and all of their basic needs were cared for. But the only company they had was one another. In 15, 20 years, presumably they would have their own language. And again, this would not be approved by an ethics board. I'm proposing this study.
What would happen is that they will arrest you first.
I know. But let's say we did that. Would they have their own language after 15 or 20? Like we would come back and find them talking, right?
Okay. If let's say that while they grew up, they had access to someone else talking, yes. However, there's been experimented, again, we're not probably they're not ethical, but not experiment, but I would talk more about studies. There's been studies about like children who had issue growing up, like not a good family, not a good caretaker. So some of these children, when find, for example, that they didn't have contact with outside world, but only with one caretaker or stuff like that. What we saw particularly was one child. This child was isolated for 13 years. At the age of 13, this child was saved and put in an environment where there were like people that could caretake, people that could teach language and all sorts of stuff. So what we saw is that this child, unfortunately, struggled. Because for what I said before, like when you're a child, it's way easier. So when you grow up, it becomes harder and harder. So especially at the beginning, this child took really long time, and still, for the side what that study says is that still has some difficulties in communication.
But for those 13 years, was the child completely alone?
Only with one caretaker, one of the parent, isolated by the rest of society.
So they weren't talking with that parent though?
Yes, they were talking with it. It was the kid and the parent talking, and that's it.
But you're saying that so obviously that's not healthy for a number of reasons, but just in the context of language, that's not enough to learn a language, one person?
Probably not enough, because the vocabulary that the father was using was not enough, and the interaction between the kid and the father were not, like proper interaction, not many interaction as well. So the child didn't have the language input they're required to acquire language.
Right.
So that's the thing. So
what you're saying is we should try my experiment.
No, please, I don't advise
You're endorsing my idea. You heard it here first.
No, didn't say that. No, absolutely. We can't do for ethical reason that. But what we know is that, again, exposure to the language, it's probably the most significant things that has an impact in the way or how much you acquire the language. And always you need to remember as well that I hear this from a lot of students like, oh, I've been studying for 4 months, I still can't speak. That's normal. Like language also follow a direction. There's always perception first.
The silent period, right?
Exactly. Good job. Hey, you prepared. So there's always perception.
Wow. You're the third, fourth person to say that on this show. It's like everyone's surprised if I give the impression that I don't prepare for these interviews. I don't know.
No, you're very prepared. It's a good to test. But yes, like you develop perception. And just in a second moment, you develop ability to talk. So that's the thing. So perception always first, and then communication, talking after. And this happens regardless of your first language, second language, third language. For all these languages, always the same happen. There is this silent period, a period in which the learner, it looks like he's not learning. Like you see a child, no? The mom tried to say something, the kid just look at her, but doesn't say anything. He's actually learning. The brain is doing like a complex work to remember, and not only remember words, but try to guess how the language works. And this is amazing. There is something called the GOAD syndrome, GOAD, like in English, GOED, that basically we know that kids at a certain age, when they start to learn English as a first language, they make some mistake. What happened? At some point, they learn that to make the past, they need to add ed at the end. I worked, for example. But then they overgeneralize this and they apply this also to verbs that are irregular. So they go, okay, right. But they don't know, they're a child. So all these happen in the brain like spontaneously. And the interesting thing is that the exactly same thing, same type of like mistake, but it only like highlight the fact that the child is actually, start to make hypotheses about a language. It happened for all the languages, regardless of the native speaker, second language, third language. It happens to children in Italy. It happened to children in Japan. Always the same. Like these sorts of mistakes are so similar that it's really interesting to study them. So that's why some people think that the way you acquire a language, first, second, third one, there is some mechanism for which is almost the same. And something, like regardless of the language itself, something happens in the brain for which the brain starts to test hypotheses. So that mistake that the child makes saying God is not really anymore seen as a mistake. It's actually good proof that the child, like his brain, he start to analyze the language and he start to testing hypotheses like, oh, since I put ed at the end of worked, maybe I can put it in good as well.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that kind of overgeneralizing. Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to talk to you about just coming back to English speakers for a moment, because in doing my research, I read that the US Foreign Service Institute ranks languages based on how difficult it was for English speakers to learn. It ranked Italian as among the easiest to learn.
Interesting.
And then German as like level 2. How is that? If English, or since English is a Germanic language, shouldn't it be easier for me to learn German than Italian?
That's interesting. Okay. First of all, when we remember one thing, that when we classify language, we have many ways of classifying a language. So one could be typology. So the typology of the language itself, and it has nothing to do with the familiarity of the language, okay? And then one other one is familiarity. So it's like this genealogical trees, no? For which exactly there is a relationship between German and English. There is a relationship between Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and so on. So from that point of view, it's true. Honestly, I kind of disagree about what a language is difficult. How do you define a difficult language? It's really subjective. It really depends on your interest, what you like.
Your native tongue.
Your native tongue as well. It depends on many, many, many things. You can't say the language is difficult. And even if you say, though, according to some studies, English, or like in this case, Italian is easier than German, I'm really not too sure. Like I have students that actually speak more languages. They would tell you the opposite. They would tell you, for me, Italian is a nightmare to study comparing to German. So it really depends. I don't really like these sorts of statistics because a lot of people think, for example, Japanese is it's so difficult. But again, it depends who you're talking to. It depends how your language is far or close. Or some people prefer it to have a language far because, for example, a lot of Italian students that studied Spanish, or Spanish is super easy, let's go study Spanish. Fine, but then they start to have troubles because it's so similar that sometimes they make mistakes because it's too similar to Italian. Right. So they tend to use the same grammar. Again, the type of like the negative transfer that we talked about before. So it really honestly depends.
Yeah, that makes sense. It wasn't even clear. First of all, it wasn't even a study. It wasn't clear how they developed that.
Maybe they ask, probably it's like a questionnaire, like, you take 200, 300, 400 people and you ask. But even that, it could be just because they sound like, are these people really studying Italian? What's their level? They study both languages to say that, or maybe they just prefer studying Italian. That's a different thing, no? Like, I prefer, it sounds better to me, so I'll go to study Italian instead of German. But what is most difficult, it really depends. It's really something subjective. You can't really say that it's something difficult. And a different stage in life, it could be difficult. I learned first Japanese, then English. Because back then, for me, English was really a hard language. But then I went back on studying the second time. I moved to England. I studied college there. And I'm like, oh, actually, it's easier. So it's really a subjective thing.
Yeah, interesting. Let's go back to the kids learning for a moment. If the silent phase is necessary for learning a language, does that mean any harm can be done in a formal classroom setting by forcing kids to speak when they're in that phase?
Very good question. That's a very good question. So again, we're not really sure. We're only talking about hypotheses and theories, okay? There's some studies that back up my point of view, but it really depends. I would tell you my opinion. My opinion is that forcing too much too soon is never a good idea. Never. For a lot of reasons, starting with what we said before, the affective filter. You're putting too much pressure on a student, and the student will shut down, will just not talk. You too much pressure, emotional filter up, and we said, with high level of anxiety doesn't come, unfortunately, language acquisition. They're on a different spectrum. So forcing too much, I think, is bad. For many, many reasons. And we see this a lot with communicative language teaching. I don't know if you know what communicative language teaching is. So in second language acquisition, there's been a lot of theories and a lot of methodology tried by professor, by researcher, grammatic approach, audio-lingual approach, translation approach, and the communicative language teaching. So in the past, for example, it was believed that, if you read and translate, that's how you learn a language. So let's use this method and see if it works. And they thought that was the method that would work. Then they try another one. So in language acquisition research, there's always a new method that works better. And then another one comes and works better. And then it's been used for a while in classroom. So for a while, now it's a bit changing, but from the early 2000s ahead, there was this revolution of the communicative language teaching. This approach, what it says this: since we can learn a language, we can learn a second language in the same way we learned the first one, so surrounded by the input, by the language, let's do this. We go in the classroom and we talk, like the mother does with the child. And if we do that, you get a language. And the success rate for this type of method, it was really high in certain contexts. So if the person is an extrovert, that totally works. If a person is an introvert, that might be a little bit different. So what I went to do actually was this. I went to Japan to study this. So because community language teaching seemed to be very popular, especially in teaching European language, English, Spanish, Italian, my question was, since Japanese people tend to be, generically speaking, and every person is different, a little bit more introverts, a little bit more shy, and have approach to study in a different way from Western country, could their approach be okay even for these people? And when I went there, I realized that no, it doesn't work. Because forcing to talk, a person that simply not only doesn't want to talk, but it's also there's a lot of culture involved in when you study a language. And this is something that teachers, they really need to consider when they enter into a classroom. So who is your student, first of all? Japanese people tend to keep silent, to be silent during a classroom, but that's not because even they're shy, it's because it's a sign of respect for the professor. So if you enter in a classroom, you force them to talk, you're going to have the opposite type of result.
In a way, you're encouraging them to be kind of rude from the perspective of their own culture, right?
Yes, exactly. This is exactly a way to not consider the culture of a person, which for me is something super important in language acquisition as well. It's not only the student that is learning a language and therefore a culture, but it's you, teacher, that needs to learn the language and culture of the students that you have in front of you to understand. Otherwise, there's some miscommunication and cultural issues that happen. So when I went to this classroom, I realized that it's not that the communicative language teaching doesn't work. And on certain occasion, in a certain way, possibly can work, but not always. And forcing to talk, it doesn't work, especially at the beginning, because at the beginning, we said that always perception first, right? Perception, then production. Silent period happened for children, it happened also for adults. So especially at the beginning, in the first few months that you study a new language, you need to respect the silent period. The student is still good, is still learning, but it takes 4 months, 5 months, 6 months to say the first word in Italian or in English or in Japanese. It doesn't matter. We need to respect the silence period. While with the community language teaching, like I don't want to criticize this method too much, it is really good for a lot of things. But the risk is to put too much pressure on the talking. And maybe a speaker is just not ready to speak. So you need also to consider like timing. Like this person has been studying language 10 years, then of course, maybe it's the time to start to say a few words in Italian.
Right.
But if this person has started to learn the language 2 weeks ago, 3 months ago, it could just be too early.
Right. So in the context of, let's say, Japan then, because that's where you did your research, what would be the best way for Japanese students to learn, let's say, a language like Italian? Would it be more of that kind of static learning in a formal classroom setting?
What I can tell you is that there is no one right methodology. It's not like language is not a package that you can deliver. This was something that my professor at University of Rome used to say. It's not like a package, a box. You give this box and it is way more complex than that.
On this show, though, we don't really like nuanced thought. We like to make wild generalizations about people.
Well, that's a tough one.
You know.
Again, the answer is it really depends. I would say that you can use a wide range of tools as a teacher with Japanese students. The very good learner, they're very focused. Like if they put something in their mind, they will come home and studying hard. And if you want to do something that is a little bit out of their comfort zone, you need to explain first to them what you're doing and why. Because the risk is, let's say I enter to a classroom and I propose to do this activity. That is a kind of fun game activity. The risk is if my students don't perceive that activity as meaningful, they might have fun with that activity, but they're not learning. So first thing that teacher should do is to explain that activity you're doing has a purpose. So, for example, okay, guys, today we're going to learn the future. And this is something actually we did in the Japanese classes. So we're learning the future. How we learn the future in Italian? We're going to learn the future by using cards. You know, like, I don't know this in English, tarocchi?
Tarot cards, yeah.
Tarot cards. So you will create groups and you give these tarot cards. But first, you need to explain what we want to learn with this is. We're going to learn this. This activity is good because you're going to have fun, but also you're going to learn this, this, and this. And then once they have clear why they're doing that, they're probably more motivated to feel like, okay, I'm out of my comfort zone, but I'll jump out. It's fine. So it's always like you need to be a little bit careful with the culture that you are interacting with. That's, I think, the thing. So generally speaking, what's the best approach? It's an approach that probably has been used by Paolo Balboni, who is a famous Italian linguist. His specialization is in second language acquisition as well. And he talked about this multicultural approach. So it's an approach they use a variety of tools based on different cultures. So, for example, one day I'll use communicative language teaching. The day after I use a more traditional approach. The day after I use another different one. In a way that, because when you have a class, you have a variety of people. And you don't want to have a standard approach. You want to change in a way that everyone feels comfortable in the classroom. But of course, that from a teacher point of view requires a lot of work, a lot of preparation, a lot of knowledge as well. And that's tough.
Yeah, and so with that approach, you know, different kids would have different days in which they thrive.
Yes, exactly. Variety. The success, it's always like variety in what you use, but always, like according to Balboni, we always need to focus on the fact that you're not entering a classroom and impose a language and a culture to other people. It's a conversation. Like you need to use the first language as well. You need to, like before, there used to be in the past this kind of like, demonization of using your first language. You're learning a second language, don't ever use the first language. Nowadays, we're discovering that sometimes, in certain occasions, you can go back to your first language and use it as support for the second one. It's not that bad, not as we thought. So again, according to Balboni, it's a matter of, as a teacher, you need to be a student yourself. You need to know the culture that you're interacting with. You need to know your students, their passion. And then, of course, that requires a lot of work.
In general, what would you say are motivating factors for learning a language? Because I'll tell you what I mean. I often think it's not the best idea that people separate languages into useful or not useful. So, for example, I've heard people, choose to study a particular language, let's say in particular Mandarin, because it's useful in a business context. And that's great. If you want to be, a business person, a CEO of a company, awesome. But if you don't, it doesn't really make sense. Like, there should be other reasons. So, for example, for me, the ability to communicate with my family was a real motivating factor to learn Italian. I don't want to be involved in business, so it makes no sense for me to learn something like Japanese. Now I'm actually interested in learning Mandarin. It's funny, but not and Japanese, because they seem so different to what I've learned, and therefore I'm attracted to the challenge.
Okay.
So it's taken me, I guess, a longer time to become interested in those languages. But yeah, what do you think? Do you think there are sort of motivations that are limiting? Like if you think something's useful, you're probably not going to stick with it, because at some point maybe your goals will change. Does that make sense?
You already answered the question yourself.
And then that's we're good.
Why I'm here. No, the only one answer that is backed up by study and stuff is actually motivation, full stop. Whatever is your motivation, it could be passion for the language, it could be work, it could be willingness to speak to your family, it could be studying arts and literature, it could be interest, it could be challenge. It's a challenging language. I want to prove myself that I can do this. Wherever is your motivation by itself is the only one factor that is necessary for you to have good results in language acquisition.
Right.
So that's the thing. Wherever is the motivation, it doesn't matter. But that's the point with, for example, that happens a lot in Italy, that people feel they're like forced to study English because English is important. If you take a teenager that perhaps doesn't even care much about using English. Nowadays probably is different because, you can also use English to interact on Instagram, social media, and the sort of stuff. But 20 years ago, like myself, I was studying a classic lyceum. I was studying Latin, Greek, biology, chemistry, philosophy.
Showing off now.
Showing off a little bit. But I didn't care much about English. And I was why I didn't like it? Because it was forced on me. I have to study because it's the language that you need. And I was like, who says that? I'm going to learn every other language around the globe in a way that I won't need English. So whenever I go to a country, I can speak with the people with the language that they use.
Yeah, when it becomes an imperative, it just sort of...
When it becomes an imperative, definitely that doesn't help. But again, I wasn't motivated enough. Then what happened is that when I start to study Japanese, some of the language books that I needed to take this Japanese proficiency test were in English and Japanese. And I couldn't understand the English part. And I'm like, gosh, I need to study on this book, but I can't understand the English part. So I would go to the Japanese to try to understand the English one. And it was hard. And then I would travel in another country and I was like, oh, I can't talk to people. Then the motivation happened. I'm like, oh, I need English. I needed to traveling. But then my motivation changed. I was motivated. So if you're motivated, you're going to be fine.
I guess because it no longer became theoretical. You were confronted with the practical benefits.
Exactly.
And it's the same for me. I mean, growing up in primary school and high school, we do Italian. Yes. My family speaks dialect anyway, so it's not like I really had the opportunity to learn standard Italian at home anyway. But yeah, it wasn't until I went to Italy for the first time in my early 20s and met my relatives who were all incredibly loving but couldn't speak English. Yes. I was confronted with a practical reason to actually start learning properly.
But that's the thing, again, it's like, wherever is your motivation, it has to be motivation. If you're not motivated, if you study the language because your parents told you so, but you couldn't care less, it's difficult that you're going to achieve good level. Maybe you're going to learn something, sure, but it's difficult you're going to achieve a good level. And this is the difference that this linguist we were talking about before, Stephen Krashen, made. He makes a distinction between language learning and language acquisition. So learning is something that you do in the classroom. Consciously. Acquisition is that process when the language becomes natural. To give you an example, when you start to learn how to drive, especially like not automatic car, but like manual one.
Right.
So at the beginning, you need to learn, okay, this is the first, how to use the gear. So you're learning. So you tell every time your brain, or remember here, now I need to put the gear because I hear. So you're telling, you're constantly controlling what you're doing, okay? So that's learning.
Mm-hmm.
You acquired your ability to drive a car when you do that without thinking. And that's the same different about language now. So you have that proficiency that we're talking about at the beginning, when you have this ability to think in the language without even thinking, like thinking automatically. So that's the thing. So if you have motivation, you can definitely reach the level, regardless of your age. Again, as your age gets a little bit harder, sure, but you can reach the level. If you don't have the motivation, doesn't matter. You can study 8 hours a day. Then you can say, I've learned a language, but you don't have it acquired. It's not in you.
Right. People should have to learn languages the way I had to learn manual, which is with my mum next to me going, oh my God, oh my God, we're going to die. We're going to die. And see what that does to their stress levels.
Yeah. We were talking about before the emotional filter.
Right.
No, that must have been very good for you.
Yeah, no, it was good. Very supportive.
Very supportive.
So, I alluded before to the fact that I feel like I've hit a wall with my Italian. So would you say that it, in this case, is just about finding that motivation again? Is that what hitting a wall is in the context of a language?
Yeah, there's two things happening. I mean, motivation has a lot to do. But why at some point the motivation switch? For example, you said something interesting. You love the language. You needed to speak with your family. You're very excited and you start learning the language and you get better, better and better every day. Then at some point you reach the level and you're stuck. You're stuck there. You stop. This is what we call in English like fossilization. Fossilization. So you're stuck in the level. So why that happen? Why you're no longer motivated? Most of the time, not always. There could be a lot of things, but most of the time what happens is that once you reach the level that we talked about before, the threshold level, the survival level, so the level that allows you to survive in the country where the language is spoken, to speak to your relative, even in normal sentences, to do the most things that you would do on a daily basis, your brain feels, that's enough. I don't need anything more. Why would I challenge you? Why would I be stressed, studying, using time? We always, like, our brain tends to answer this economic language attitude, like easier, faster,
right.
Less effort. So to do that, what do? Easy. Like, I don't need it more. That's what your brain is telling you. Like, can you speak to your relatives now? You can, right? Can you buy grocery in Italy? You can. Can you order a cappuccino in Italy? Of course, you can do that. Right. You can do all those sorts of stuff. So you already reached the level that you need for the motivation that you have at the beginning. So now your brain is saying, that's it. I have this level. I don't need anything more. I can survive in their environment. That's why a lot of people can actually, like, there's more people that learn a language up until threshold level. It's after the threshold level that it gets harder and harder. Not because it's harder, the level itself. Actually, you built already your grammar in the new language. It gets easier from B1 level to get B2, C1, and C2. Issue is the motivation that goes behind.
Right.
Because you already your Italian, let's say, is good enough. So why taking the time, spending the money to do more?
Right. It's almost like diminishing returns. So it's more effort for no real gains. Yeah.
Exactly.
I wonder if a part of it is also that since I started working here, I'm surrounded by native speakers, which has been helpful in a lot of ways. But I'm also confronted with my limitations every day in a way. And I feel like that has also helped, has also made me go back in my shell in a lot of ways because I'm just more aware of the mistakes I'm making. And
that's a good point. Self-awareness in language damages actually the language acquisition process. When you get self-aware, you get nervous. And again, activate that emotional filter that we don't want to activate. And that stop the language process acquisition as well. So that's the thing. It could be actually you surrounded by a native speaker and sometimes you feel like, oh gosh, why I'm not understanding them? But most of the time, because native speakers don't speak the standard version of the language. And that's another point. Like when we say we're learning a second language, which version of the second language are you learning? Like language, again, is not a box done, packed and ready. It's more like a fluid that changes depending on the person you're talking to, the time. Is it written language? Is it spoken language? Is you are in the city, you are outside, like it's a regional variety. So language is variety in all the senses. So it really depends. But if you start to judge yourself, you start to be self-aware and you start to think like, oh my God, for example, today I was at lunch with Irene. I couldn't understand what she was saying. My Italian must be bad. Oh, I don't want to use it. I'm embarrassed. I'm ashamed. That's stopping from learn. Most likely the reality is not what you're thinking, is that I speak fast, true. I speak in a variety of Italian that is more close to Roman or like Central Regional accent and slangs. And so my Italian gets a little bit far from the standard variation of the language, which is the one that actually you use. And that's it.
I will say though, just you're not the one I struggle with though. You're actually one of the easier ones to understand.
It's so interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Which variety of Italian you struggle with?
The gentleman from Genoa.
Okay.
And our Tuscan friend in the booth sometimes.
That's interesting that you struggle with Tuscan. You probably know the history of Italian language, or you know that the original dialect that was chosen
was the Tuscan. It's a dialect of Tuscan.
I mean, it's not the Tuscany they speak right now, and it was like
12th century Tuscan.
12th century Tuscany, and it was a pure form of Tuscany. So Pietro Bembo, this academic guy, he decided that the Tuscany that was used was a little bit too dirty, like there were too many bad words. So he cleaned that version of Tuscany, or Fiorentino, not even Tuscany, it's proper from Firenze, Fiorentino, and that is the language that was widely spread. But then again, with age, or the language changed a lot, so it's not the same language anymore. But it's interesting that you struggle with that. Maybe it's a matter of, I don't know, like hearing, like accent. Or...
Could be. Yeah, it could be. I'm not too sure. And obviously this episode's not so much about the Italian language, so people at home can apply it to whatever language they're learning. But different people have different accents, and you're not learning one particular thing. And that's been a real challenge for me, is sometimes my Italian goes so far with one individual and nowhere with another one. And for example, I studied at an Italian school in Napoli. And
interesting.
As soon as you leave the classroom, it became very difficult to practice.
Totally.
Even if the people that I was trying to practice with switched from dialect to standard Italian, the accent alone made it really tough for a beginner. And so I think that's just part of learning a language in general, right? Is tailoring it to individuals.
It's part of learning a language, and I think it's easy to get frustrated when you learn a language, but also we need to, give ourselves a break and understand we're doing something amazing. We're using a code that we didn't know a few years before, and now you're using to communicate with strangers. It's something amazing, but it's also normal. Like I do the same. I tend to get frustrated with my parents-in-law. They're from New Zealand. And especially my husband's mother, when she speaks, for me, it's hard to understand. And if we're having conversation one-to-one, I can totally understand. If we are in a table and there's noise, there's loud music, and she's also talking to me fast, it gets to the point that I'm like, why I can't understand there? So sometimes it's a matter also of a lot of factor. Maybe you might be more tired one day. So you same person, you might not be able to understand because you're tired. And what has to do with language? Well, your brain is processed a lot. It's like going to the gym. It's doing a huge workout when you speak a second language. That's why we think that it's very good to protect your brain, to learn a new language, not to protect from Alzheimer's disease, dementia, all sorts of stuff, because you're creating neuronal connection, you're strengthening your neuronal connection. So it's a gym that your brain is doing. It's exercise. So if you're tired, if you have a little bit of headache, and you're talking to 10 people at the same time with different accent, with variation of dialect, of course it's difficult, but it's not your competence that is not good enough. It's the situation that is challenging.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I even remember going to the language school. It was 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. every day, Monday to Friday, and I was wiped at the end of it. I was genuinely wiped. It's really, really tiring. Okay, this is a very strange question perhaps, but can we read anything into dreaming in foreign languages? Because I've been studying Italian for, I think, 9 years now. This is my 9th year. And in the last couple of years, I've had, I'm going to say, 2 or 3 dreams in Italian. Does that mean anything, or is it just...
Oh, probably that you're your language acquisition, let's say, is at a good point. Like the moment you dream a language means that your brain start to work using the language.
Right.
So it's like, it's a good sign, definitely, Like means that you have the competence to speak. Again, once you reach that threshold level, the B1 level, you're able to do that. You're able to dream in the language. It means that you're surrounding yourself by the language. It means that, again, your brain can use a different neural connection, the one that used the other language, not the first one, and is a very good sign.
Yeah, interesting. All right, well, let's end on that positive note. Irene, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's been really fun, really great.